At 30,000 feet, tensions on Flight 729 are about to reach an unexpected boiling point. Ethan Cross, a quiet and composed author, boards the flight carrying a satchel with the unfinished manuscript of his late wife's life work, a testament to resilience and equality. He hopes for a peaceful journey, but his calm demeanor and frequent glances at his bag catch the attention of Cynthia Walsh, a paranoid and prejudiced passenger. As Cynthia's baseless suspicions escalate into accusations, the plane transforms into a battleground of fear, judgment, and division. Passengers are forced to choose sides as Ethan's quiet dignity clashes with Cynthia's unrelenting hysteria. With each passing moment, the stakes rise, and the truth becomes harder to see. But Ethan is no ordinary passenger, and his satchel holds more than just his wife's legacy. It holds the power to reveal the cost of ignorance and the strength of grace under fire. As the plane prepares to land, shocking revelations will leave passengers questioning everything they thought they knew about justice, humanity, and themselves. Gripping, emotional, and deeply thought-provoking, Silent Justice is a story about the quiet courage it takes to stand tall in the face of prejudice, and how one moment of dignity can ripple through countless lives. Prepare to question your assumptions and witness the triumph of compassion over chaos. Will you side with fear or understanding? Buckle up, this is a flight you won't forget. Ethan Cross adjusted the strap of his satchel as he stepped onto Flight 729. The bustle of passengers settling in surrounded him, but his focus was on reaching his assigned seat. The satchel, containing his late wife's manuscript and a small sculpture she had created, was not something he planned to part with, even for a moment. As he walked down the aisle, he caught the eye of Cynthia Walsh. Her sharp, scrutinizing gaze followed him as he placed the bag under the seat in the emergency exit row. Cynthia shifted in her seat, clutching her purse tightly. "Excuse me," she said sharply to the man in the aisle beside her. He moved aside, startled, as she leaned slightly forward to get a better view of Ethan. Something about him unnerved her, though she couldn't articulate what. Ethan sat down, aware of her stare but choosing to ignore it. He opened his book and let out a small sigh, hoping to sink into its pages and away from the weight of the week. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, helping passengers stow their luggage. Grace Lynn, wearing her well-practiced smile, greeted each row. She stopped near Cynthia, who was still staring at Ethan. "Can I help you with anything, ma'am?" Grace asked warmly. Cynthia snapped her attention back to Grace, hesitating for a moment. "No, I'm fine. Just making observations." Grace nodded, though she couldn't help noticing Cynthia's tension. She moved on, checking seatbelts and overhead compartments. Meanwhile, Ethan flipped through the pages of his book, the hum of the plane's engines offering a calming rhythm. Cynthia, however, grew increasingly agitated. Every time Ethan adjusted the strap of his satchel or glanced at it, she felt a rush of unease. She raised her hand just as Grace passed by again. "Yes, ma'am?" Grace stopped, her tone polite but firm. "I'm not sure if anyone's checked," Cynthia whispered, leaning closer. "But that man over there, by the emergency exit, should he be sitting there? I mean, isn't that risky?" Grace blinked, maintaining her professionalism. "All seating arrangements comply with safety regulations, ma'am. Is there something specific that concerns you?" Cynthia hesitated, looking at Ethan as if expecting him to pull something alarming from his bag. "Well, you just hear so much these days. I just think it's better to be cautious." Grace nodded patiently. "I understand, but I assure you, everyone on board has been screened. Please try to enjoy the flight." As Grace moved away, Cynthia huffed softly, crossing her arms. The plane roared as it ascended, and passengers settled into their routines. Ethan put his book away briefly, pulling a water bottle from his satchel. Cynthia stiffened at the motion, leaning slightly forward in her seat to get a better look. "What's he doing now?" she murmured to herself. The elderly man beside her glanced at her. "He's drinking water," he replied flatly before returning to his crossword puzzle. Ethan noticed Cynthia's gaze, but chose not to react. He placed the bottle back into his bag and resumed reading. Across the aisle, Grace observed the interaction. She approached Jim Carter, her fellow flight attendant. "Keep an eye on 22A, she said in a low voice. She's fixated on the man in 18C. Jim raised an eyebrow. What's the issue? Nothing obvious yet, Grace replied. But I have a bad feeling. The plane leveled off, and passengers unbuckled their seatbelts. Cynthia remained rigid, her eyes darting between Ethan and his bag. She leaned toward her seat neighbor again. Don't you think he's been acting suspicious? She whispered. The elderly man sighed. Ma'am, he's reading a book. Let the man be. Cynthia's jaw tightened as she turned her attention to Grace again, signaling her with an impatient wave. Grace approached cautiously. Yes, ma'am? That man, Cynthia said, her voice low but firm. He keeps fiddling with that bag of his. I really think you should check it. Grace glanced at Ethan, who appeared relaxed and oblivious. She turned back to Cynthia, keeping her tone calm. Ma'am, as I mentioned earlier, there's no cause for concern. If you notice anything specific, please let me know. Cynthia scoffed, leaning back in her seat. You people always say that. Until it's too late. Grace held her composure and walked away, but the unease in Cynthia's voice lingered in her mind. Cynthia's irritation grew with each passing minute. Watching Ethan's every move, she saw him reach into his satchel again, this time to retrieve his medication. Her imagination spiraled. That's it, she muttered under her breath. Standing abruptly, she waved Grace over once more. This time, her voice carried across the aisle. You need to search that bag, Cynthia demanded. Now. Passengers turned to look, their murmurs spreading through the cabin like wildfire. Grace approached quickly, her voice steady. Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice. You're alarming other passengers. I'm alarming them? Cynthia exclaimed. What about him? He keeps checking that bag like he's hiding something. Are you going to wait until it's too late? Ethan looked up, meeting Cynthia's gaze for the first time. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of sadness. Ma'am, Grace said firmly, stepping between them, please return to your seat. If you continue disrupting the flight, I will have to inform the captain. Cynthia hesitated, her face flushed with frustration. She pointed at Ethan. I'm telling you, you'll regret not listening to me. With Grace's insistence, Cynthia reluctantly sat back down, but her muttered words and sharp glares ensured the tension in the cabin was far from resolved. Ethan quietly returned to his book, but his hands shook slightly as he turned the page. Grace caught Jim's eye from across the cabin. He nodded subtly, signaling he was ready to step in if necessary. The flight settled into uneasy silence, but for Ethan, Cynthia's glare burned as brightly as the engine hum filling the air. The murmur of conversations filled the cabin as passengers began to settle into their routines. Cynthia Walsh, however, was far from settled. Her eyes darted toward Ethan, seated quietly near the emergency exit, occasionally glancing at his satchel. Unable to keep her suspicions to herself, Cynthia leaned toward the young woman seated across the aisle. Excuse me, she said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Have you noticed that man over there? Doesn't he seem off to you? The young woman glanced briefly at Ethan, then back at Cynthia with a confused expression. No? He's just reading. That's what they want you to think, Cynthia muttered. People like him, they always act normal. Until they don't. The young woman shifted uncomfortably and returned to her in-flight magazine. Cynthia huffed and turned to the elderly man beside her, determined to find an ally. Don't you think it's strange? She asked. The way he keeps looking at that bag? The man didn't even look up from his crossword puzzle. Lady, I think he's just minding his own business. Maybe you should do the same. Cynthia's jaw tightened, her irritation growing. She glanced around the cabin, searching for someone, anyone, who might share her concern. Unable to contain herself, Cynthia stood abruptly, her voice rising above the cabin's gentle hum. Excuse me. Flight attendant. Grace Lynn appeared almost immediately, her expression calm but cautious. Yes, ma'am? Is there something I can help you with? It's him, Cynthia declared, pointing at Ethan. That man near the emergency exit. He keeps fiddling with his bag, and I think he's hiding something dangerous. You need to do something. Ethan froze, his book halfway closed. The weight of the cabin's collective gaze pressed down on him, but he said nothing. Grace's polite smile faltered as she glanced toward Ethan, who looked back at her with calm, tired eyes. Turning back to Cynthia, she spoke firmly. "Ma'am, as I mentioned earlier, all passengers have been screened. There's no reason to believe there's a threat here." Cynthia crossed her arms. "You can't be serious. What if he's planning something? What if it's already too late?" "Ma'am," Grace said, her voice dropping an octave, "I need you to lower your voice. You're alarming the other passengers." "Good," Cynthia snapped. "Maybe they should be alarmed." Ethan sighed and finally spoke. "Ma'am, I promise you, there's nothing dangerous in my bag. I'm just trying to get to Los Angeles in peace." Cynthia narrowed her eyes at him, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Oh sure, that's what they all say." Grace stepped between them. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. If you continue to disrupt the flight, I'll have no choice but to involve the captain." Cynthia hesitated, her lips pursed in frustration. Finally, she sank back into her seat, but not before muttering, "You're all going to regret this." In the cockpit, Captain David Harper adjusted his headset as Grace entered, closing the door behind her. "Captain, we've got a situation," she began, keeping her voice steady. "One of the passengers, 22A, has been accusing another passenger of suspicious behavior. It's starting to draw attention." Captain Harper frowned. "How serious is it?" "She's loud, but the man, 18C, hasn't done anything wrong. He's just sitting there, reading. I don't think there's a real threat, but her behavior is making people nervous." The captain nodded thoughtfully. "We can't afford to let this escalate. If she acts up again, let me know. And if it gets out of hand, we'll notify security at LAX." "Yes, Captain." Grace turned to leave, but paused at the door. "He's being very patient about all of this, but I can tell it's wearing on him." Harper gave her a reassuring nod. "Just do your best to keep things calm. We'll handle it." Grace returned to the cabin just as Cynthia stood up again, her voice rising. "I'm not going to sit here while you all ignore the obvious. He's up to something." Ethan closed his book and set it on his lap. He took a deep breath, his voice measured. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think is happening, but I assure you, I'm not a threat." "Oh, really?" Cynthia shot back. "Then why don't you prove it? Show us what's in that bag." Grace quickly stepped in. "Ma'am, I've already explained." "It's fine," Ethan interrupted, his tone calm but weary. "If it'll help end this, I'll show her." He unzipped his satchel slowly, pulling out a small, clear plastic container. "This," he said, holding it up, "is my medication. I have a heart condition. That's why I keep checking the bag, to make sure it's secure." Grace nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Cross." She turned to Cynthia. "You see, there's nothing to worry about." But Cynthia wasn't convinced. She shook her head. "No, that can't be everything. He's hiding something else. I know it." The cabin fell into an awkward silence as passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Grace stood tall, her voice firm. "Ma'am, this has gone far enough. Please stay seated for the remainder of the flight." Cynthia sat back, her face flushed with frustration. "You're all blind. You'll see. You'll all see." Ethan returned the container to his bag and zipped it up, his expression neutral. He picked up his book again, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his exhaustion. Grace leaned down to him, her voice soft. "I'm so sorry for all of this." He offered her a small, tired smile. "It's not your fault." As Grace moved down the aisle, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Cynthia sat rigidly, her arms crossed, her eyes still fixed on Ethan. Her mind raced, fueled by paranoia and indignation. In his seat, Ethan stared at the same paragraph for minutes, unable to focus. The hum of the engines filled the silence, but the weight of Cynthia's gaze was inescapable. He knew this wasn't over, and so did she. Cynthia's breathing grew shallow as she stared at Ethan. She'd spent the past half hour silently fuming, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. To her, every movement he made was calculated, suspicious. When he leaned down to adjust his satchel for the third time, she could no longer hold back. Unbuckling her seatbelt, she stood abruptly, causing heads to turn. Marching down the aisle, she stopped in front of Ethan's seat. "You!" she snapped, pointing a trembling finger. "I've had enough of this. Open that bag right now." Ethan looked up from his book, his expression calm but weary. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Cynthia said, her voice loud and shrill. "Open it. I want to see what you're hiding in there." Before Ethan could respond, Grace appeared, her voice sharp but controlled. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat immediately." "No," Cynthia barked. "He's hiding something dangerous, and no one is doing anything about it. I demand to see what's in that bag." Ethan set his book on his lap, his hands resting on the cover. "Ma'am, I've already shown my medication to the flight attendant. There's nothing else in the bag." "You're lying," Cynthia shouted, her voice carrying through the cabin. Passengers began leaning into the aisle to get a better look. Grace stepped between them, her tone firm. "Ma'am, this is unacceptable behavior. Please return to your seat, or I will have to involve the captain." Cynthia's face flushed with anger. "You're all blind. This man is a threat, and you're just letting him sit here like nothing's wrong." Grace exchanged a glance with Jim, who had joined her in the aisle. "Ma'am," Grace said, lowering her voice, "you are disrupting the flight. If you don't return to your seat right now, we will have no choice but to restrain you." Cynthia's eyes darted between Grace and Ethan. "Fine," she spat, retreating to her seat, but her muttering continued. "You'll all see. You'll regret ignoring me." The cabin remained tense after Cynthia's outburst. Ethan could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on him. Some glances were filled with sympathy. Others were tinged with doubt. Grace approached him quietly. "Mr. Cross, are you all right?" "I'm fine," he replied evenly, though his clenched jaw suggested otherwise. Grace hesitated, then added, "If there's anything you need, please let me know." "I'm sorry for all of this." Ethan gave her a small nod. "Thank you. But I think it's best if we just get through this flight." As Grace walked away, Cynthia's muttering grew louder. "I don't believe him for a second," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "He's hiding something. I know it." Ethan turned in his seat, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I understand that you're afraid, but I assure you, I am not a threat to you or anyone else on this plane." Cynthia scoffed. "You think I'm just going to take your word for it?" "I would hope so," Ethan replied, "because the alternative is baseless suspicion and fear, and that doesn't help anyone." Despite Ethan's calm response, Cynthia's paranoia continued to grow. She stood again, shouting, "I won't sit here and do nothing while he puts us all in danger." Passengers gasped and murmured as Cynthia's voice cut through the cabin. Grace and Jim rushed to her side, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am, you need to sit down now," Grace said firmly. "I won't," Cynthia yelled. "You're all just waiting for something bad to happen. But by then, it'll be too late." Ethan remained seated, his hands resting on his lap. He refused to meet Cynthia's gaze, focusing instead on keeping his breathing steady. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're aware of the situation in the cabin, and I assure you it's being handled. Please remain calm and seated." Cynthia reluctantly sat down, but her muttering didn't stop. "This isn't over," she whispered. After the captain's announcement, Grace knelt beside Cynthia's seat, her voice low and measured. "Ma'am, I need you to understand something. Your behavior is causing more disruption and fear than anything Mr. Cross has done. You're putting this flight at risk." Cynthia glared at her. "I'm putting the flight at risk? What about him? He's the one you should be worried about." Grace sighed, her patience fraying. "Ma'am, we've spoken to Mr. Cross. We've checked his bag. There is no threat here. If you continue to disrupt the flight, we will have to take action to ensure everyone's safety." Cynthia crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're all going to regret ignoring me." Grace stood, giving Jim a subtle nod. Together, they positioned themselves near Cynthia's seat, ready to intervene if necessary. The cabin settled into an uneasy silence. Passengers avoided looking at one another, their eyes focused on their books, phones, or the in-flight entertainment. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to block out the tension that seemed to hum in the air. He thought of his late wife and her unwavering grace in the face of adversity. Her voice echoed in his mind. Dignity isn't about winning. It's about standing firm in who you are. Meanwhile, Cynthia sat rigidly, her gaze fixed on Ethan's satchel. Her hands gripped the armrests, her mind racing. She was convinced she was the only one who saw the truth, and she wasn't about to let it go. As the plane continued its journey westward, the atmosphere in the cabin remained heavy, each passenger silently bracing for what might come next. Ethan opened his book again, determined to project calm, even as the storm brewed just a few rows behind him. The cabin, though quieter after the last confrontation, buzzed with unspoken tension. Ethan sat in his seat, head tilted toward the window as the clouds rolled by. Across the aisle, Cynthia Walsh fidgeted, her fingers tapping against the armrests. Her eyes darted back to Ethan's satchel, convinced that its contents held the key to her growing paranoia. Suddenly, Cynthia sprang to her feet. "I can't stay silent any longer," she shouted, startling the passengers around her. "This man is a danger to all of us." The murmurs of confused passengers quickly grew into whispers of alarm. Grace Lynn rushed forward, her face calm but firm. "Ma'am, please sit down," she said, her voice carrying over the growing noise. "I will not sit down while everyone here is at risk," Cynthia yelled. She turned to the passengers nearby, pleading with them. "Don't you see? He's been acting suspicious since the moment we boarded." Ethan turned slowly, meeting Cynthia's gaze. His face remained calm, but his eyes were heavy with exhaustion. "Ma'am, I don't know what else to say to convince you. I'm just here to fly like everyone else." "You're lying," Cynthia screamed, pointing a trembling finger at him. "Why won't you open that bag? If you've got nothing to hide, prove it." Passengers began to murmur, some leaning into the aisle to get a better view. A man sitting 2 rows ahead turned around, frowning. "Lady, sit down. You're the only one making this flight unsafe." Cynthia ignored him, her focus entirely on Ethan. Ethan exhaled slowly, placing his book on his lap. He opened the side pocket of his jacket, retrieving something small and metallic. Standing up, he raised it so everyone could see. "My name is Ethan Cross," he said, his voice steady but commanding. "I'm a retired professor and an advocate for racial equality. And this," he held up a badge, "is proof that I'm also a consultant with law enforcement, specifically focused on conflict de-escalation training." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Cynthia froze, her face paling. "I'm traveling today to deliver my late wife's manuscript to a charity in Los Angeles," Ethan continued. "The bag you've been accusing me about contains that manuscript, along with the sculpture she made before she passed away. Nothing more, nothing less." Grace stepped forward, addressing the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cross has provided valid identification, and we've already verified the contents of his bag earlier in the flight. There is no threat here." For a moment, the cabin was silent. Then, one by one, passengers began to nod, a few even clapping quietly. Cynthia, however, wasn't convinced. She shook her head violently, her voice rising. "This could all be a trick. Anyone can flash a badge. He's still hiding something." The murmurs in the cabin shifted from Ethan to Cynthia. Passengers whispered among themselves, their glances turning disapproving. "Lady, give it a rest," one passenger said loudly. "She's delusional," another muttered. Cynthia's eyes darted around, her breathing quickening. "You're all blind," she shrieked. "You're falling for his lies." Grace stepped closer. "Ma'am, that's enough. You're disrupting the flight and causing undue stress for everyone on board." "No," Cynthia screamed, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. I'm trying to protect you all. I'm the only one who sees the truth." Jim Carter, the senior flight attendant, moved forward and placed a gentle but firm hand on Cynthia's arm. "Ma'am, you need to calm down. If you don't, we'll have to restrain you for the safety of the passengers and crew." Cynthia pulled away, her voice trembling with hysteria. "You can't silence me. You're all in on this. You're protecting him." Passengers began to visibly recoil, some shaking their heads. A young woman leaned across the aisle, addressing Cynthia. "You're embarrassing yourself. Just sit down and stop harassing that man." Cynthia's face twisted in frustration, but it was clear she was losing the battle. The captain's voice came over the intercom, firm and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harper speaking. I've been made aware of the situation in the cabin. I want to assure you that the safety of our passengers is my top priority. If there are any further disruptions, those involved will be met by security upon landing." Cynthia's shoulders slumped, but her expression remained defiant. Grace and Jim guided her back to her seat, where she sat stiffly, glaring at Ethan. The cabin gradually quieted, though the tension lingered like a storm cloud. Ethan sat down, placing his badge back in his jacket. Grace leaned down to him, whispering, "Thank you for staying calm through all of this." Ethan nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he picked up his book again. As the plane began its descent, the seatbelt sign dinged on, and passengers started preparing for landing. Cynthia muttered to herself, her words incoherent but filled with frustration. Ethan stared out the window, watching as the sprawling lights of Los Angeles came into view. He thought of his wife, her unshakable faith in humanity, and her belief that dignity could triumph over ignorance. Across the aisle, Grace observed Cynthia closely, ready to intervene if necessary. She exchanged a look with Jim, who nodded, signaling that they would escort Cynthia directly to security upon landing. The cabin remained quiet, though the tension was palpable. Ethan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. In a few moments, the ordeal would be over, and he could focus on the mission he'd set out to complete. As the plane touched down, the passengers collectively exhaled, the weight of the journey finally lifting, though not entirely. For Ethan and Cynthia, the story was far from finished. The cabin vibrated softly as the plane's wheels kissed the runway, drawing a collective sigh of relief from the passengers. For the first time in hours, the hum of the engines was less oppressive, signaling that the ordeal was almost over. Ethan Cross sat still, his satchel resting securely on his lap, his eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the lights of Los Angeles flickered like scattered stars, a stark contrast to the tension that had hung in the air moments earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles." Captain Harper's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured. "Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. We appreciate your cooperation and understanding during this flight." Understanding. The word hung heavy in the cabin, a quiet irony considering the events that had unfolded. Across the aisle, Cynthia Walsh sat rigidly, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her lips moved as if she were rehearsing a defense, muttering inaudible words. Grace Lynn, standing near the front, exchanged a glance with Jim Carter, both ready for what was to come. As the plane came to a full stop at the gate, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began shuffling to gather their belongings. Ethan remained seated, knowing this was not his moment to move. Two uniformed security officers entered the cabin, their presence immediately silencing the low murmur of conversation. They walked deliberately down the aisle toward Cynthia. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We need you to come with us." Cynthia's eyes widened as she leaned back into her seat. "What? Why? I haven't done anything wrong." "Ma'am," the other officer said firmly, "we need to discuss the incident during the flight. Please stand up." "This is ridiculous," Cynthia exclaimed, her voice rising. She pointed toward Ethan. "You should be questioning him. He's the one who's dangerous." The passengers nearby turned away, unwilling to meet Cynthia's wild gaze. Ethan sat quietly, his expression neutral, refusing to react. "Ma'am," the taller officer repeated, "please stand. We don't want to escalate this further." Grace stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "Ms. Walsh, it's best if you cooperate. Let's resolve this calmly." Cynthia glared at her, her body rigid, but after a tense moment, she stood abruptly, muttering, "This isn't over." The officers escorted her down the aisle, her protests echoing in the quiet cabin. "You're all blind. You'll see. He's not who he says he is." As the door to the jet bridge closed behind her, the cabin erupted in a collective exhale. Ethan waited until most of the passengers had disembarked before standing. He adjusted the strap on his satchel and turned to Grace, who was busy directing the remaining passengers. "Ms. Lynn," he said softly. Grace looked up, offering a small smile. "Mr. Cross, I'm so sorry for everything you've had to endure on this flight." Ethan nodded. "You handled it with grace, no pun intended. Thank you for staying professional through it all." Grace hesitated, then said, "If I'm being honest, I've never dealt with anything like this before. I just hope we didn't fail you." "You didn't," Ethan assured her. He reached into his satchel, pulling out a slim hardcover book. "This is for you." Grace took the book, reading the title, Through the Clouds, Finding Peace in Turbulent Times. She looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "You wrote this?" "My wife and I did," Ethan said, his voice tinged with emotion. "She passed away a year ago, but this was her vision. I think you'll understand why I want you to have it." Grace nodded, clutching the book tightly. "Thank you. I'll treasure it." As Ethan stepped into the jet bridge, he could feel the weight of eyes on him. Some passengers stood waiting for their carry-ons, their glances a mixture of guilt and admiration. A man in a business suit cleared his throat as Ethan passed. "Hey, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for not stepping in earlier. You handled yourself better than I would have." Ethan gave a polite nod. "Thank you." Another passenger, the young woman Cynthia had tried to recruit, stepped forward. "I feel terrible for doubting you." "I'm so sorry." "It's all right," Ethan said gently. "Sometimes silence is easier, but it's not always the best choice." The young woman nodded, her face flushed with shame. As Ethan moved toward the terminal, the murmurs faded, replaced by the bustling noise of the airport. Ethan walked through the terminal, his steps steady, his grip on the satchel firm. Ahead, he saw a familiar face waiting near baggage claim. Maria, the charity director who had helped organize the event in Los Angeles. "Ethan," Maria called, waving enthusiastically. Ethan smiled as he approached. "Maria, it's good to see you." She looked at him closely, her smile fading slightly. "You look tired. Rough flight?" "You could say that," Ethan replied with a wry chuckle. "Well, you're here now," Maria said brightly. "And we're all so excited to see the manuscript and sculpture. It's going to make such an impact." Ethan nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "That's all I wanted, to make sure her work lives on." As they walked toward the exit, Ethan glanced back briefly, seeing the Los Angeles skyline through the large windows. The city lights shimmered, a reminder of the world outside the confined cabin, a world where understanding still had a chance to flourish. With renewed resolve, he stepped forward, ready to continue the mission he and his wife had started together. The turbulence of the flight was behind him, but the journey toward empathy and change was just beginning. Cynthia Walsh sat in a starkly lit holding room at the Los Angeles airport, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly, their sterile glow reflecting the cold, gray walls around her. Two security officers stood near the door, their presence a constant reminder of her actions during the flight. A senior official entered, holding a clipboard and a calm, authoritative demeanor. "Ms. Walsh," he began, pulling out a chair across from her, "we need to discuss your behavior during Flight 729. Cynthia glared at him, her voice sharp. "Discuss? What's there to discuss? I was trying to protect everyone. That man, Ethan Cross, is a danger, and no one listened to me." The officer raised an eyebrow, flipping through his notes. "Ms. Walsh, multiple passengers, the flight crew, and even security checks have cleared Mr. Cross. Your accusations were unfounded and disruptive." "I was doing what no one else had the courage to do," Cynthia snapped, her voice rising. "I saw the signs and I acted." The officer leaned forward slightly, his tone firm. "And your actions caused undue stress, endangered the safety of the passengers, and required intervention. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the impact of your behavior on everyone else on board." Cynthia opened her mouth to argue, but found herself unable to respond. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face as she sank back into her chair, realizing the gravity of her situation. Meanwhile, Ethan Cross sat in a nearby room, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee provided by airport staff. He leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaustion evident in his posture. A security officer entered, offering a polite nod before sitting across from him. "Mr. Cross, we appreciate your cooperation," the officer began. "I just have a few questions about the events on the flight." Ethan nodded. "Of course." The officer flipped open a notebook. "From your perspective, when did the situation with Ms. Walsh escalate?" Ethan sighed, recalling the series of events. "It started shortly after boarding. She seemed unsettled, watching me, whispering to other passengers. But it really escalated when she began demanding that my bag be searched." "And how did you respond?" Ethan met the officer's gaze evenly. "I tried to stay calm. I explained my situation and even showed my identification to the flight attendants. But she refused to believe me." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "I have to say, Mr. Cross, the crew commended your composure. Not many people could have handled the situation as gracefully as you did." Ethan offered a tired smile. "I've learned over the years that reacting with anger only fuels the fire. My wife always believed in facing ignorance with dignity. That's what I tried to do." The officer closed his notebook and extended a hand. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Cross. On behalf of the airport and airline, we apologize for the ordeal you endured." Ethan shook his hand. "Thank you. I just hope this leads to better understanding for everyone." As Ethan and Cynthia navigated their respective debriefs, the internet was already ablaze. Passengers from Flight 729 had uploaded videos of the confrontation to social media. Clips of Cynthia's outbursts and Ethan's calm explanations quickly went viral, sparking heated discussions. Yet another example of bias and profiling, one tweet read, accompanied by a video of Ethan revealing his badge. "When will we learn?" A Facebook post showed Ethan's quiet dignity as Cynthia accused him, captioned, "Grace under fire." Comments poured in, both supportive and critical. While many praised Ethan's composure, others expressed outrage at Cynthia's behavior. By the time Ethan exited the airport, his phone buzzed with notifications. He glanced at the screen briefly but chose to pocket it, focusing instead on what truly mattered, his next steps. Later that evening, Ethan arrived at the offices of the charity he and his wife had supported. Maria, the charity director, greeted him warmly at the door. "Ethan, it's so good to see you," she said, pulling him into a brief hug. "How was your flight?" Ethan hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Let's just say it was eventful." Maria tilted her head, concerned, but decided not to press. Instead, she gestured toward a nearby table, where several team members were waiting. "Come on in. Everyone's excited to see what you've brought." Ethan placed his satchel carefully on the table, unzipping it to reveal the manuscript and the delicate sculpture inside. The sculpture, titled Unbroken, glimmered softly in the light, its intricate design a testament to his wife's artistry. Gasps filled the room as the team gathered around. Maria's eyes welled with tears. "Ethan, it's beautiful. This will mean so much to the people we help." He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. She always believed art and words could change the world. "I just hope this brings her vision to life." "It will," Maria said firmly. "We'll make sure of it." That night, as Ethan walked out of the charity's office and into the cool Los Angeles air, he paused to take in the city's skyline. The lights stretched endlessly, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the many lives his wife's work could touch. He thought back to the flight, to the tension, the accusations, and the stares. But more than that, he remembered the moments of support, the quiet nods, the apologies, and Grace's unwavering professionalism. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his wife's wedding ring, which he kept with him at all times. He held it tightly, feeling the weight of her presence. "We did it," he whispered, a small smile crossing his lips. "Your message is still alive." As he slipped the ring back into his pocket, Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward into the night, ready to continue the mission they had started together. His journey wasn't over, but neither was his hope.